Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hopefully. I'll try to talk really loud. I talk fast, not loud usually. Okay, so for all the engineers in the room, I'm going to suspend reality a lot for this thought experiment, and that might be frustrating, and I'm going to encourage a lot of communication. So when I first wrote this abstract, I was boiling the ocean, and it was completely not a thing that was really possible. And so what I'm going to do in this presentation is kind of walk you through my thought process and assumptions around how to apply decentralized technology to citizenship specifically. And then I'm going to define 3 different worlds that I imagine and encourage conversation about those worlds, specifically around the pros and cons of citizenship within the parameters that I'm going to define. So first, I just kind of wanted to level set on a topic that's really prevalent, I think especially in the blockchain space, but not just in the blockchain space. So with technological connectivity and like things like supply chains and the internet and global markets, we know that the nation state is not maybe as useful as it once was, and there are opportunities for disruption here. Some argue, kind of like the founders of BitNation, that Bitcoin and crypto is part of what's driving the need to reimagine nation states. So that's kind of the level setting there, and now I want to talk about the elements of citizenship. So in all the worlds that I'm about to imagine, I'm imagining, I want to talk about citizenship within these 3 elements. So first, citizenship entails legal rights. So that's going to be currently different based on your geography, where you're a citizen, what groups you're a part of. Second would be your political agency, which is largely influenced by the legal rights that you're afforded. And then third would be your membership in a community, or your identity and sense of identity based on your citizenship. So these are my assumptions. First, that identity is multifaceted, which we'll dive more into. Second, that individuals have this superpower of being dynamic and agile. Third, that institutions or large groups have more power because they can collectively mobilize collective resources and more effectively distribute them. And then my fourth assumption is that blockchain technology can combine these superpowers. So the first assumption, to go deeper in, that identity is multifaceted. This is something that you hear a lot of philosophers and artists talk a lot about, but in reality we know that this is the case, because I'm standing here talking to you guys today. In my real life, I am an entrepreneur for fun. I do yoga. I have a dog. Like, there's a lot of parts of what makes me me. And then to build on that, the second assumption is that individuals are dynamic and agile. And what I mean by this is that intuitively, based on our situation and based on the transaction at hand, we're able to adapt or mute parts of our personality or our identity to make sure that that transaction goes as effectively or as smoothly as it should. So this is mostly a cynical view of that, but for instance, curating your online identity and making sure that that is somewhat separate from maybe what your employer sees is one example of that. And then the third assumption, that institutions are more powerful because they're leveraging collective resources and able to mobilize that, so that is my third assumption, and I expect that one will be up for debate, because what I'm assuming that they lack by asserting this is that they lack that ability to be as agile or dynamic and change as quickly as an individual can. So this is where I end up. I think that blockchain offers us the opportunity to have organizations that leverage both of these features. So a cooperative might be a manifestation that we're all used to, or we all know about and we're used to seeing, that has both of those, in theory, both of those superpowers. So my hypothesis going into this was that decentralized technology applied to governance structures and identity means that we could potentially have more robust opportunities for citizenship. So maybe more opportunities for political participation, different kinds of legal rights, and maybe it could even look more like our multifaceted identities already do. So I'm going to dive into the three worlds from my perspective, and then field you guys to add color to them. And the questions I ask of all of these are, what does this hypothesis look like, and what problems still remain? The first I'm calling liquid citizen. BitNation and I think Democracy World, some of the companies in this space are already using the liquid term to describe governance structures that can change and evolve with their constituents better than current nation states can. So when I think about this, I think about the pros and cons. So let's say that you have a digital identity, kind of like Drew was describing earlier, or even you're potentially able to tokenize parts of your identity as they're relevant to certain political issues. So what would the advantages of that be? Let's assume that, I guess I should have said at the beginning, most of this thought process is coming from a Western American perspective, so I'm thinking a lot about our democracy when I'm thinking through these things, so I'm very open to other perspectives. But when I think about what it would mean to have multiple parts of my identity be represented most effectively politically, I think about how decentralized technology, or even tokenizing things like my being a woman, could potentially, what could we do with that in the government that exists today? And so I thought that, for instance, if you could weight your vote or allow certain parts of the population for which legislation would directly impact to weight their vote more based on it impacting them, perhaps we could pull out of the two-party system, or so I'm kind of stumbling over my words a little bit. But in the existing systems we have in America, we are often forced to suspend or prioritize our political beliefs and desires. And what that leads to is not, I would argue, not sufficient representation of the various social groups. So in this model, if you could break that down a little bit, you could potentially ensure better representation of those voices. So I kind of go back to the female example, but if there's certain legislation that is only going to impact me, maybe my vote counts more in that regard. And even though there's going to be vast disagreement within that particular social group, still the end result should be a little bit more fair. And there's a variety of examples of that. Another benefit of this I see is potentially increased social mobility. So for instance, because my identity, my digital identity is decentralized and I only have to reveal what's relevant for that transaction, perhaps my employer doesn't need to know my race or my gender. And I imagine we could think of other examples of that. And so the idea would be that that would help increase social mobility as well. One of the pitfalls that I see, which I think exists in the governance structures today, is that we still have the issue of the uninformed and uneducated citizen. And that could remain as a vulnerability, because they're political issues that affect large swaths of us, or all of us, for which I am not an expert. And so why, even though that legislation may impact me, should I have the same or more of a weighted voice? So I think I would like to describe each world and stop for conversation. So I want to stop here and ask if anyone has any questions, or if you see other pros and cons of a society that looks like this.
So it strikes me that, like, the geographic regions would have different concepts of what civil liberties are. And so I guess, could you just talk about, when you're saying this is world one, are you imagining this is a world with uniform civil liberties, or are you imagining this is a world where the concept of a civil liberty in one region is totally different than it is in another.
So in this case, I'm considering that we still have the same geographic and regional borders that exist today. And actually in the next world, I will eliminate that.
I guess one problem might be is who defines like the labels of, you know, what demographics are you part of? I know at least the feminism movement right now, it's a big debate on like, is trans person actually a female? Like, who are you deciding like what you identify as far as those sort of demographics go, or does the state?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, and I think it's hugely problematic. There's problems on both sides of that. So the example used is incredibly relevant because we could all identify as one particular political interest group, and that's a vulnerability of the system for sure. I don't know how to solve that, but I'm interested in other ideas on that.
About the weighted vote idea, how is that different from corporate lobbying? I mean, it is kind of like a weighted vote.
It's very similar to that, only the idea is that applying decentralized technology to the individual identity would allow individuals to also have that power.
So in this model you're proposing, would you say that there would be a transition from the you as citizen of a nation are required to then to give up your life for that nation? It's kind of like this negative, like you're like you have this debt to the nation. Instead, would you kind of flip that on its head, and nations instead would be like, oh, come to us, we'll give you all these incentives, and it's more about positive additions about what it means to be part of a nation state? Do you see as this is part of being a liquid citizen? Like kind of like immigration and immigration, things pushing people out and things pulling people in, like those dynamics kind of changing, or what do you see like that?
I do think in this particular model that it reprioritizes the welfare of the individual citizen in a way relative to the collective that we're not seeing today. But I think military, in each of these worlds, military defense is a question, how to handle that.
Yeah. I guess like what I was trying to say more along the lines of was, would there be like a market for citizenship where you have like people bidding for your citizenship and saying like, oh, hey, I can offer you this. I'm going to one-up you. I have like 10% positive tax, or I don't know, something like that.
Yeah. So that's actually a good segue into the second world, which I imagine as borderless and as having basically co-opted nation states that have no physical borders that are competing for your citizenship. And the positive is one of the positives is what you're describing. One of the other positives that I see is increased geographic mobility. But I think that like some of the companies who are working on this, I disagree with some of the companies who are working on this that argue that conflict and war is often driven by having borders. I think that some of that conflict you can't escape. It's inherent in the terrain and the region. And so the con of this world, I think, is that it is difficult. How do you defend citizens if you defend your citizens that are not, or that are in a region where there is conflict, when maybe none of your other citizens are experiencing that? Does anyone have anything to contribute on the idea of no borders?
So if the incentive is, so I'm an immigrant, right? And one of the reasons a lot of immigrants strive to become American citizens is to achieve geographic mobility. That's the glory state, right? And now if you commoditize geographic mobility, which I think some small countries are already doing, is selling their citizenship in exchange for, well, money, right? I think St. Kitts or Grenada, right, is selling a lot of Chinese citizens, for example, a lot of wealth, but don't have a lot of mobility, geographic mobility, right? And so it's created a natural marketplace where Grenada, this innocuous island in the middle of nowhere, is selling Chinese citizens Grenadian citizenship, which gives them this geographic mobility. Even the European Union like my parents they live in Cyprus, and there's like this huge issue where Chinese citizens are coming up and buying up property in Cyprus because that's a pathway to citizenship and therefore EU citizenship and therefore geographic mobility. So it's already sort of manifesting in its ways is that passports as a service is what's happening right now.
Yeah, I think Estonia is also a really good example.
How does a system like this deal with bad actors? Of maybe I get together with a group of people, we form a nation state of with bad laws essentially. Like, well, my laws say it's okay for me to pick your pocket or punch you in the face and laugh at you and things like that. And I interact with people that might share geographic proximity to me, but a different quote unquote set of laws. I mean, how do you handle that?
Yeah, so when I thought about the lack of borders, and when I first started this project and tried to think of the kind of fully decentralized utopia, it became one of the most dystopic thought processes ever. And I think yesterday, David kind of touched on that. If your only option is to opt out and it's one centralized global system, this is a huge problem, especially for citizens that are born into it. I don't know how to solve that problem, but I think in the case where there isn't just one central or one global decentralized, nation, then you could opt out and go to another, but I don't know how you would solve the intermingling or the negotiation between the two virtual nations that are in geographic proximity. I think geographic proximity is the biggest issue with this one.
One pro I see, I'm not sure what to call it. I'm going to call it, it would improve humanity's immune system. If there's regional conflict or there's famine, if there's famine in India and half the population can't eat, everyone would be getting out, but very few people would have the ability to move between nations because there's a whole visa process and everything. But with no borders, it'd be very quick to change, and so populations could move much more quickly according to where the resources and where the opportunity lies at that moment. Yeah, I guess that's it.
I guess related to what you just said, the challenge is that there are a number of scarce resources in the world that are and that right now borders limit access to those in a sense. So if, for example, to take your the famine thing, right? If there's not enough food supply in a geographical area, right now borders is like the way we deal with that, right? But and it sort of limits the competition to interstate competition and sort of moves it away from the individual level to the state level. And I'm not 100% convinced it's better that to bring all the competition for every single resource back to the individual level. So there's a trade-off there, it seems, where you don't want people sort of killing each other running to get the food. And right now, borders implicitly do this in limiting the access, but
In practice, how it actually works is it gives people that already have access to wealthy resources, people in developed nations, the ability to block out access from other actors. And so, as Americans, we want to say let's protect our borders so we can have it well, but from a worldwide perspective, from humanity perspective, it's best if we distribute those equally, even if that means less for us.
I don't know, one thing generally, I know you were talking about the immune system of kind of having borderless citizens. I have a coworker who really likes this idea and talks about it a lot, and I would just say one of the points which he talks about is he links this to nuclear disarmament, because if you have citizens dispersed throughout everywhere, the extremely large weapons that can attack cities, if you have citizens in every city, it might make less sense to have these big honeypots to attack for the nation state. A point which he talks about a lot, like I said.
So one side effect is if you have kind of open borders at a governmental level, I mean, people can create gated communities and other ways to keep out people that they don't really want to deal with. And like you see this kind of in a de facto. I'm from LA. There's tons of gated communities because people don't want to deal with certain other people. Or if you go to like, when I went to Cape Town, it was very dramatic where you see Cape Town is very dramatic where you kind of keep like physical segregation in that regard, so that you could see an increase of that even if there's not, you're by law able to go everywhere. De facto, you may not be able to.
I think those are all really, really interesting points. There's one more, yeah.
Yeah, I would just say a note of caution on the, it's definitely admirable and nice to think that it would help people get from one bad place to another, but like the Syrian refugee crisis just is like on the brink of breaking the EU right now. And I feel like with the lack of governance, you could imagine a world that's like that old movie, The Warriors, where everybody has to pick a gang and arm up and sort of decide who is going to protect their rights if there's no formal institution that is designated to do that.
Yeah, no, that's kind of where I got with the mental model as well. It's pretty bleak.
Yeah, I mean, the other example, which is like pretty big fiction, and this is like Snow Crash. If anyone's read that book, I know a lot of times you have these big corporations where it is a similar thing. You join a gang corporation and they privatize all of the things, and it's a very negative, like, anarcho-capitalist worldview. But it's an interesting book. It's like in the 90s, talks about cryptographically secured currencies and all these other things.
Cool. So I'm going to dive into the last world, which that I can imagine, which may be equally as unfeasible as the other two, but a world where both our digital and our physical identities are distinctly separate. So there's kind of a manifesto written by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, as probably the organization I think of most when I think of this concept. But if we could potentially leverage decentralized technology to separate the two, potentially we could have entities or have citizenship in a physical geographic government as well as a digital one. What would the advantages and disadvantages be? So I can't actually, the farther I thought along this, the more it was very apparent that those things are inextricably connected. But I'm very interested in your opinions on how and if that can work.
I think one interesting way to think about this is that it's already here, but it's partially distributed, right? So corporations can kind of cherry pick their jurisdictions in a way that maybe individuals, unless they're super wealthy, cannot afford to. But we could look at the way corporations domicile their revenue, or individuals change their place of residence for tax reasons, as a thing that maybe everybody could have in the future if dual people can pick an electronic citizenship system. So it wouldn't maybe be that different from how people and corporations do it now, just more widespread.
I just wonder if maybe the digital parts of our identities might become more important as time goes on, and so it could be possible that the physical portions, the sort of legacy governments, might in some ways get a little simpler. You know, they might make a move like NASA. They go from building rockets to funding those that build rockets. And I think as you put there, so one pro is a relief from archaic regionally based governance. Another pro might be, hey, you get to keep your sort of standard government, regional government that keeps other people from bashing me in the head and taking whatever they would like. But you get the advantages of the flexibility of digital, I guess, of digital identity, digital citizenships as they break up into many small pieces that you can combine, which I think is what you sort of indicated as you started talking. Yeah, I don't know.
One good model for this, we're currently working in the world. Estonia has concept of a digital citizenship. You don't have to be from Estonia. You can be from anywhere in the world. I think you have to have a use case that you're doing business with someone somehow in Estonia. but it's essentially allows you access to the entire EU market. You don't have as many rights, so it's not quite equal. It's less than than actual citizenship, but it allows you to do many of the things, and you can create businesses and do trade with other people in Estonia and by proxy throughout all of the EU. So that's maybe a good model to look at.
One thing I think that could be beneficial is just in the transition. So a pro of having dual citizenship is kind of, you hear about the transition from the kind of the nation state to the sovereign individual is not fun, right? So a pro would just be the fact that this is like a good kind of bridge, maybe.
Are there any areas of your digital identity that can be completely unlinked, you think, and governed totally separately from any physical identity?
I feel like there's probably an issue with like taxation and whatever your place of residence is, or wherever you're defining your digital residence, right? There's going to be a conflict of interest there. Your geographic location is going to want you to pay taxes to cover the infrastructure of that country, but you may also desire to have, like you were talking about, citizenship somewhere else to reduce the tax that you're paying, and then there's going to be this weird, there's going to be a resistance there, but there's also going to be like this kind of race to the bottom where countries say, we'll only charge you 7% tax, or we'll charge you 5% tax, and I don't really know how that would evolve. Just a thought, yeah.
So, sorry, I was talking to someone from the Consensus Open Law Project about this sort of worldview, and one of the challenges that I see with it is that, like, you can have smart contracts that represent, some kind of legal agreement between you and any number of parties anywhere in the world, but if the mathematical side of this agreement, is clear, the enforcement in the case of a failure to comply still enforced by regionally based legal infrastructure. So in the case of like surrogacy, where like a woman carries a child, for some other group of individuals who are trying to have a child, it's actually illegal to contract on that in New Jersey. And so there's this problem where people sign these contracts in New Jersey for surrogacy, and then someone doesn't hold up their end of the bargain and they bring it to the court throws it out immediately because it's not a valid legal contract in that region. And so it strikes me that like your rights are inherently tied to the region that will ultimately be responsible for enforcing whatever you're talking about.
So just to add to the Estonia point, they do have an alternative taxation scheme as part of that. So their deal is that you don't pay tax on your corporate income until you withdraw a dividend. So if you leave the money in the company, it builds tax-free. So an interesting twist. And another problem that I don't think any of these things solve is what some people call the asymmetric stakes in the game. So you have a company that's in a narrow niche, and they can afford to just dump in $10 million into lobbying for something that's, say, of only incremental impact to me, right? So let's say my utility is going to raise their rates an abusive amount, right? So my electric bill is going to go up $50 a month. And I'm mad, but let's face it, I'm not going to go hire a lawyer to fight them. I might give some organization some money to go mount an attack against them, but they're going to wheel in $5 million worth of lobbyists, and they're probably going to get their rate increase. So.
I also think as I was kind of walking through all of these, each one of them, the same problem that today that I think it was Plato who described that argued for representative democracy because citizens are uneducated and uninformed. And regardless of what we want to think of ourselves in that regard, I know that energy law impacts me, and I'm not well enough informed to be an expert advocate for something like that. And I think when you take that, plus some of the for lack of a better term, like the mimetic warfare tactics, I don't think those will go away. And even if we decentralize into smaller kind of co-opted nation state groups or organizations advocating for ourselves, I don't think that any of those groups will be any less vulnerable to these tactics, and maybe there's even a bigger business there because there's more of them.
Have you looked into seasteading in terms of the citizenship discussion? Because I've been thinking of religious to develop and mature the seasteading movement, because I think citizenship is a product of shared ownership of or like an ownership of a shared experience, right? And I think if you can construct that that shared experience through I'm going to the Mecca, or I'm going to the seasteading platform and building my platform, right? So maybe that's another source for like, refactored citizenship discussions.
I think that's the seasteading movement and some of the humanist movement is really beautiful, but I think that when you think about markets, I can't read your name tag all the way back there, but when you talked about digital nations competing for your citizenship, I think that is probably a more natural evolution of this stuff. I think corporations today, at least in the States, start to look a lot like, wield similar powers to nation states.
I think also your notion of shared experiences providing the basis of identity is actually really well shown in the Burning Man. Like where the people that attend there, they're all burners, right? So you could basically say that like when everyone is a part of Burning Man, this shared experience they have creates them all citizens of this like pseudo state that comes together for a period and then it disbands. So yeah, there's a familial tie there. But the notion is ephemeral, and that's kind of very interesting because usually nations have like this like eternal notion. So seasonal citizenship. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And I guess the last thing that I can say is the reason that thinking about how decentralized technology can reshape how we think about citizenship and identity, the reason that's interesting to me is not just because I think identity is the starting point of any application, but also because wow, completely blanked. Well, I do believe identity is a starting point for everything, but I think that the existing structures, and we're seeing this very much in like the FDA or the SEC, our legal and regulatory bodies are not able to keep up with the pace that other aspects of our society are evolving. And I think it's really important that we find ways to change that.
So to throw out kind of a zany idea, we're looking at kind of opening up, if you will, some of these existing citizenships, but I can imagine creating a world where you create new citizenships like based on what city you're from within existing cities and layering on top, like almost creating more barriers. And I can almost see that actually potentially being a good thing, particularly as there's very real like regional divides within the United States, and that having kind of like small barriers there that would enable, I don't know, more trust, I guess, within like kind of the larger society if there was more of a wink link across the United States globally. But that wouldn't be necessarily like anyone can move anywhere, or you kind of like go in and out of citizenship identities, but almost creating like more barriers.
There's actually a lot of research on the re-rise of the city-state with the death of the nation-state. So you're definitely onto something.
Yeah. This is more of an idea, but thinking about your concept of digital versus physical citizenships, it feels like what's interesting with the fact that you can have these things be digital is that they don't have to be binary. So maybe there's also sort of a sliding scale there where if I wanted to be like a 10% citizen of the US, I get access to a certain amount of things, and vice versa, right? Like maybe I can spread my citizenship across different countries at different stakes, basically. Yeah, basically a portfolio, and then what that introduces also is there's sort of like an idea of markets within citizenships, which might be a way to kickstart it today, because you look at like passports is like the main token of citizenship that we have today, and there's like rankings of better passports depending on like what countries they give you access to and which visas and so on. So yeah, I feel like it could be really cool to open these more than binary conceptions of citizenship.
I think also the other comment about potentially adding more citizenships and barriers that was just made kind of goes in with like the gated community idea. I mean, you have so many communities even where it's like, I do live in Austin right now, I've only been here 2 years, but everyone's like, oh, all the Californians are coming over here, like, we don't want all these, and you have other places which are attractive, and like, those are like concepts of like people from at least the Bay Area. I know also talk about all these people are moving in and driving up the housing prices, and I could imagine if you have this identity that you use in like a somewhat tribal negative way, if you could have these smaller scale identities that you can very easily identify with and be like, look at this, I have my Austin token, I actually am from Austin and stuff, that could be bad.
I have one half-baked thought, actually. I've been thinking about, it seems like part of what like sort of the nation states did was they hollowed out this like intermediate area, that there was sort of like the autonomous individual, and there was like the state, and all this sort of like intermediate structure of like the community or, you know, your church or whatever it is sort of disappeared. So I'm curious if there's something in which sort of like blockchain and identity, you know, I guess like an optimistic vision for that is, you know, you could sort of rebuild these communities around something you choose, as opposed to sort of an area you're born or like the church your parents went to or whatever. You have some sort of agency or choice over these sort of intermediate structures. But it seems like those intermediate structures are valuable, and perhaps even like an arbitrary one is better than none at all. I guess that's sort of that's a conservative take on it. But I don't know if anyone has any thoughts.
I mean, I think an interesting point to kind of go on with that community point is that I think that there was more of like an obligation to contribute, where that middleman has kind of disappeared. I mean, and you can kind of, you can take it one way or the other, like maybe whenever you were younger, at least whenever I was younger, I'm speaking from my experience, like my mother was very, you know, she cared a lot about me going to church, and then, you know, it kind of forced my responsibility and my productivity in that community, and therefore that community had a greater impact on my life. And, you know, so I guess that's kind of what's interesting, because, I mean, if you really want to go out and you want to volunteer to be a part of like an intermediary group, like I want to join a blockchain Facebook group in Chicago, I can go and do that, but it's like kind of what responsibility and what contribution do I have to that, which really influences how much impact it has on me or how much influence I have on that community.
So this is kind of a far-out idea as I was listening to this discussion about, if you think about no taxation without representation, what if you flipped it on its head, where you were literally purchasing your votes, like straight up vote with your wallet and and now it sounds evil to people, but it seems like actually more fair form of governance, that we are straight up, I paid for this, so I get to put this much weight into it.
So I think one of the features of citizenship is that there's a default in a specific. Right. Well, that like that implies a default state, not participate the benefits. So I've actually vote actively, but yet like drive on smooth roads, right? Because if we go into this state of like paying for everything that we consume, it's like we'll have to vote every time we want like water, drops of water. Every time we want to flush our toilet, kind of like that's a result of a vote. So I think it's important that citizenship incorporates like what is the default state of being a citizen. Like if you were to have a baby in this So I mean, in the 80s, I think a big part of being a citizen in this country was a lot of folks used to just fly to the U.S., give birth to babies, and come back. Children would automatically become U.S. citizens, right? And that was, the U.S., have a baby, come back, and your child is going to inherit the benefits of U.S. citizenship, and they get those benefits. So I think citizenship is also a symptom of like default state mechanisms.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for an awesome discussion.
Thank you very much.